about, the connection between being a millennial and caregiving. I think there's this real sense of disruption in life stage. I think there's this real sense of confusion related to navigating the healthcare system and looking to technology to try and address the problem and it not being able to in the way that we're used to. And that constellation of factors, while we're also trying to manage maybe kids, maybe career progression, is really challenging, I think, in a way that can be paralyzing if we don't kind of acknowledge it and try and think about ways to move forward.
Did you know that in 2020, there were 53 million caregivers in the United States? And by 2025, this number is expected to grow to 62.5 million. 73% of these caregivers also have a job. They are called working caregivers, and they are invisible because they don't talk about their caregiving challenges. Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees, is a podcast that will show you how to support working caregivers. Join Selma Archer and Zack on the Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast as they show you how to support working caregivers.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever and whenever you are dialing in. We want to thank you for listening in and for subscribing. My name is Zack and this is the Working Caregiver, the Invisible Employee podcast.
And I'm Selma Archer. Thank you all for being here with us today. What's going on in your world, Zack?
I just came back from visiting with Mom and living the caregiver life that we talk about on the show so many times. I was really happy to see that Mom actually is doing really well. It takes a lot. I know that a recent podcast talked about all the atrocities that are going on in the nursing home, and I have to feel fortunate that it's not going on in my mother's, but I have to say I've been diligent. I've been on top of it. They know who I am, and the executive director and the staff, we work together. But, man, I hope everybody checks out our recent podcast with Susie Singer-Carter and some of the things that are going on in nursing homes that we've got to reform and correct. How about you? What's happening on the West Coast?
Well, I had the pleasure of reading this great book, finishing it up. It's called The Millennial Caregiver. We are so excited to have our guest with us today, Dr. Rachael Piltch-Loeb, to talk about her amazing Millennial Caregiver book. Welcome, Dr. Piltch-Loeb.
Thank you, Selma. Thank you, Zack. It's great to be here.
Yes. Well, we want to start. We definitely want to talk about your book. But before we get into that, we like to start with just an icebreaker question. So can you tell us something interesting about where you're from?
Sure. Well, I'm originally from outside of Boston, actually. And I think that there's something about home is always still where you grew up, even though I haven't lived there now, I think for, I don't know, maybe close to 20 years. So I grew up in a small town in Massachusetts next door to where the Patriots play. And so football games were always kind of a fun thing to try and go to, or tailgates at least. But now I am based in Manhattan, and as in classic New York fashion, I can hear construction going on right outside my window. So I'm totally entrenched in the urban environment now that I live in. I don't know if that's interesting or terrible, but that's what's going on right now.
I think what might be more interesting is tell us how do you handle telling people you're from Boston while living in New York City?
I know. I think my mom has 6 brothers, and I think that they still cringe when my oldest child, tells them he likes to go the Yankees and loves the Knicks and all those sports teams that are utter rivals with the Red Sox and the Celtics. It's kind of funny.
Wow, that's amazing. Hey, no place like New York.
That's right. It is a unique place, that's for sure. Lots at your fingertips. That's the plus.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about your care journey. I actually ran across your story when I was reading an article, and your face was on the picture with your dad, and it had a big write-up about you being a new mom to a newborn, a caregiver to your dad with Alzheimer's, an academician working, in academia, in public health. And I just thought, how is this superwoman handling all this responsibility? I have to meet this lady. And I researched your book, and I started on that, and I was even more intrigued. So we had to have you to talk to you directly about the work that you're doing and your accomplishments. So let's start by if you could share your care story with
Yeah,
our audience.
absolutely. Thank you for kind of mentioning all of that. It's so wonderful to kind of know how you learned about the book, and I'm so glad that it's kind of getting out there. My book was really inspired by the care journey, as you just kind of alluded to, which was I was in my late 20s. I was a new mom, and my dad, who was only 58 at the time, was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. And it's called early onset when somebody's diagnosed before they're 65, which also means before they're technically a senior citizen, before they're eligible for Medicare. And so there's a lot of, I think, surprise when that cognitive decline starts happening at such a relatively young age. And so I am one of three children, and my mom and my dad were still married at the time. And our family went into sort of crisis management mode. What were we going to do to support my dad, who was physically extremely capable. He looked tan and healthy and thin and like the pinnacle of health. And inside, his mind was failing him. So we all took on kind of different roles in that experience, in kind of the day-to-day management of what he needed, in researching kind of his care options, in figuring out the financial and legal implications of what he would need, and what we needed to do to be prepared to kind of support him as healthcare proxies and power of attorney and all these things that you don't kind of think about until you're faced with a clinical diagnosis that is not going to get better. In fact, it's only going to get worse. And I think for me as an individual, and as an adult child, still looking to my parents for guidance as I was like beginning the parenthood journey myself, for professional guidance, for, life advice, it was a really shocking moment to sort of say, I'm not ready for this. And to think about what I could expect. And the reality was when I went to, Dr. Google or to friends and family, not a lot of folks who were in my age group and in a similar life stage to me could really relate to what I was going through. And I had a hard time finding resources electronically or kind of in the literature to help me understand what I could expect. And so as I kind of went on the care journey and as our family did that, it became clear to me that it felt like a valuable add to kind of pull together what we were experiencing and what I talked with other young caregivers about into a book. And that is what inspired my book, The Millennial Caregiver, and the resource that you ultimately found.
Wow, that's amazing.
Like Selma, I found you by listening to a podcast after she told me about your book. And I got to tell you, I'm kind of a sappy guy now that I've become a grandfather. And,
Yeah.
and as I listened to your story, I've heard the word sandwich caregiver so many times, but when you talked about it, it really, really, really impacted you because your father wasn't the grandfather necessarily that you might have envisioned. And you went through those emotions. I think it'd be really important for our listeners to listen to hear a little bit more about that. I'll put the link in our show notes of that great podcast that you did. But I would love if you could just share a little bit about, why it's different, perhaps, that you're raising a young child and you're now helping with your father and some of the emotions that go through that, and not to take those for granted.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said really hit the nail on the head that, I think when we traditionally think about the sandwich generation, it's folks who they may have children still in the household, but they're at a little bit of a more established state in adulthood where they're caring for their traditionally quote unquote aging parents, and trying to kind of manage what that looks like almost as they are on the tail end of raising their children. And I think the difference was for me, I was really in the beginning stages of starting my family and envisioning what I hoped would be my parents' role in their lives. And my dad was an amazing parent and grandparent while he was still capable, in the sense that he was He loved kids. This is a man who chose to go back to school in his 40s to become a middle school math teacher, which
Yes.
I think, any listener can probably say what was wrong with him? Maybe we should have known then. I'm joking, but that's not something that a lot of people volunteer to do, but his kids were kind of out of the house, and he really had the empathy to be patient with young people. And he loved babies too. He just loved kids. When my son was born, he had a hard time sleeping, and my dad would just put him on his chest and they would relax together. And I sort of had these visions for how much he would be able to cope and tolerate and be present with my kids as they grew. And pretty quickly that kind of vision was lost. And it's something that I still miss to this day, because I just know he would have been such a wonderful presence in their lives. And that kind of sense of calm and patience and, letting things roll off your shoulder as you need to, which is something we all should kind of learn to do, especially when you have kids, is something that I sorely miss. And I think that what was additionally really striking was that my dad's mother is actually still alive in her 90s. And so there was this sense of what I would call the double sandwich, right? You have an older generation that is still present, and he was kind of in the middle, right? He wasn't the top slice of bread, so to speak. And so, there was a real, I think, surprise and a real change in expectations, and that sense of shifting expectations, the lack of ability to kind of manage what I thought would be was really stark and striking, and still sticks with me now.
Wow. I think they call you then a club sandwicher. Club. A lot
exactly. Lots of
lot
bread.
of layers of bread. Yeah. Just one quick follow-up. I don't know how old your children are, but do you have any advice for our listeners? What do you tell children if they ask questions like what's wrong with grandfather, or why are you always helping? Do you have any advice for that? Not to put you on the spot, but I think you're good at this, doctor.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually an amazing question. So my sister is actually an art therapist and a kids therapist, and she wrote a children's book called What's Going On with Papa Bear, which uses, which, all listeners, if you are in this position, really should check out. And I, wouldn't mention it, but you did bring it up, and it's an amazing resource that's been picked up by lots of local bookstores and therapists that really uses a family of bears to explain to kids what's going on when the adult bear is really struggling to kind of repeat the same behaviors and memories that they once were able to do. That was actually inspired by conversations we had with my now 5-year-old. How do you explain kind of what's going on with Papa, his grandfather, when he's no longer able to kind of play and do some of the same things that he was able to do? And we ultimately, once he passed away, sort of talked about how Papa will always be in his heart, how we can talk about memories with him. We can, still do the things we loved to do with him, play ball or strum a guitar. That was something that my dad and my son kind of connected on, music as a general sentiment. And so I think that we focused on, sometimes Papa forgets, sometimes his energy changes just like yours does. He's always in our heart, and we can do similar things that made you happy with him, with mommy and daddy and whatnot. So, I think that it's not imperfect. I think folks will approach those conversations differently, but that's really what resonated for our family with my son.
Thank you. That is fantastic advice. And we are definitely going to put a link to your sister. What's your sister's name?
Jessie Piltch-Loeb, Jessica.
So that's What's Going On with Papa Bear, right?
Yep.
Awesome. So when you stepped into your caregiver journey, you were working.
Yeah.
Did you share your care status with your employer? And if so, what was the reception? Did you get support you needed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as you mentioned, I'm an academic by background. I'm a professor of public health now at the CUNY Graduate School of Public Health. At the time, I was a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I, in some ways, had the blessing of flexibility that was granted to us by the pandemic, where, you had a certain number of hours in the day, you had things you needed to get done, but we weren't allowed to be present in offices, right? So we could be physically present with people in our lives a little bit more. And so in some ways, everybody was coping with different health challenges at that time, whether it was related to the pandemic or something else. And so I had more flexibility in my schedule, just in terms of the traditional work hours. It was not something I disclosed to an employer at the time. I'm not sure I necessarily, and it's hard to know, would that have looked differently had there been expectations of being in person? Because I do think that without flexible, work schedules or work arrangements, these conversations are necessary in a much, much earlier. I know for my mom, for example, or my brother, there needed to be kind of more upfront conversations with their employers, because it meant, for my brother, he had to fly to a different destination to come when he would visit my dad. Or for my mom, it meant, at any day she could need to leave the office or jump off of a call or whatever it was. And I think she too, even in general, had work flexibility, but she couldn't, there was only so many times you can drop everything at a moment's notice before you have to kind of acknowledge it to your employer. And those conversations can be challenging, because I think, I don't know, in this country, we have a general challenge with family medical leave, even if it's for your children or for your spouse. And so let alone thinking about kind of what that looks like for a different family member, kind of getting establishing expectations and allowances for that can be really complicated. And that kind of concept of how do you have those conversations with an employer, and how do you, if you do need to modify your presence in the workforce, how do you think about the skills you build as a caregiver to, if you do ultimately want to reenter the workforce, are things that I tried to address in the resource that I created.
Did your professional background as public health professional, did that support you in any way in your role?
Yeah, I think it was absolutely helpful in the sense that I had a good handle on certain dynamics that exist within the healthcare system. One, how siloed it can be, when we think about the differences between a memory care facility or a psychiatric facility and an emergency room, and how or a traditional doctor's office that's not connected to a hospital system. What I mean by siloed is, if one is diagnosed, is prescribing certain medications, there should be no expectation that the other facilities are going to know unless you tell them that those medications are necessary for your loved one. So I had some sense of the level of research and advocacy that was going to be necessary to support my dad when he was ultimately kind of interacting with different aspects of the healthcare system. And I think that what can be really hard, especially for my generation, is if we haven't had to interact with the healthcare system, we are in for a rude awakening with how frustrating it can be to navigate, like how redundant we need to be in terms of kind of reinforcing the things that are necessary for the person that we are supporting. If there was an allergy, or my dad had certain pre-existing health conditions that would preclude certain procedures from happening. He was prone to, say, like a stroke or a blood thinner issue. Those weren't always in his chart. So he could very easily have been in danger had somebody really not been there to advocate for him. And when you're talking about a patient who is in cognitive decline, they're really not able to advocate for themselves. So we knew really quickly that we needed to have somebody with him at all times if he was going to be in a medical facility, for example. And so I think that having a background in public health and some familiarity with the healthcare system was helpful. I would say the other area in which it was helpful was trying to think about different ways to approach researching things that could be beneficial to him, whether that was, whether he was eligible for any clinical trials, which he ultimately wasn't, because he was under 65, and all Alzheimer's clinical trials are focused on older, senior citizens, which was too bad. But the reality of kind of how clinical trials exist at the moment, or different kind of the evidence there to support different sorts of intervention types. So I think those skills really did come in handy at that time. And I think that similarly, my siblings, my mom, we all had different sort of complementary skills. I am not a perpetual optimist. The world is not like in rose-colored glasses for me. My brother is much more kind of lighthearted and optimistic in temperament. And so we each kind of had different ways, I think, in which we coped and which we supported each other and my dad based on who we were and our kind of professional and personal attributes.
Wow. Great.
Wow.
It's very helpful. Yeah.
Extremely.
Helpful stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your skill sets and background has certainly come in handy. But I have to confess, I mean, I was in HR when my father had a stroke. I didn't know where to go, where to turn. And I'm supposed to be the resource person. I'm supposed to be able to help people to turn. Until that happens, you almost don't know. And I was also a part of a caregiver support group where a woman broke down and said she's well educated. In fact, she's in academics rather. And she said, I shouldn't have to choose between my job and taking my mother to an appointment after being told she has cancer. And then I just bring up FMLA, which you mentioned, Dr. Rachel, which is important, but she didn't really understand it. And she's just thought that it was this thing that will be a negative consequences if you take it. So there's so much education that we need to do, even with FMLA, though I don't remember the exact number, but the National Alliance for Caregiving just came out with their 2025 report in collaboration with AARP, which we'll put a link to that. A lot of great data. Talks about how caregivers are younger and younger. So it's so exciting to have you on our show. But also that there are more caregivers tapping into FMLA, like a 57% increase since the last time they did it, which was in 2020. But that's not the only answer. Employers really still need to have on their radar that there's so many other ways we need to support caregivers. Do you, in your experiences, can you share some suggestions that employers can maybe implement to create a culture of care?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, to your point, FMLA is but one program, and we already know that there's not enough days allowed for all the different kind of caregiving types that likely exist, right? Because if you're a caregiver for an aging parent or an ailing loved one, you may also be a caregiver for a child, or you may need maternity leave support or whatever it is, right? And so, I think that the challenge with our existing programs is you almost have to choose which type of caregiving you're going to opt for sometimes, and that's so hard, I think, when you're in these roles. But to answer your question, rather than go off too much on a tangent there, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said culture of care, a culture of support. I think that first and foremost, caregiving for somebody who is not a child can be really hard to talk about. It can be hard to talk about in the workplace. It can be hard to talk about even with friends and with family who aren't in that situation. So I think that in some ways, the first step is acknowledgement, right? Employers recognizing that this is something that their employees are likely to be experiencing. I mean, the numbers don't lie, right? I think one in 5 people is a caregiver at this point in time. Those numbers are only growing as kind of boomers age and more people kind of start to decline. So recognize whether that is a brown bag lunch where you bring in a speaker who is comfortable talking about caregiving, or you build it into kind of your policies that there are flexible work hours for those who need to take folks to an appointment, or flexibility in general to the best of a company's ability. So I think starting by trying to figure out ways in which we can create that culture, acknowledge that employees are going through this is critical. I think there's also informal ways in which work can be a support for people who are in caregiving roles. And I say that only because I think there is an element of escape for some people where it's a little bit easier to go to work than to stay home and be a caregiver. And, when you're a caregiver and you're at home, if you want to go to the bathroom, you have to choose between, are you bringing the person with you? What's going on, right? Because if you can't take their eyes off them for a second, it's kind of like having a baby in certain instances, right? And I don't mean to make light of it, but you really have to think about how you're making moves 24/7. When you're at work, you've got a little bit more flexibility. You want to have that coffee. You want to get up from your desk. You need to have a collegial moment. Oftentimes you can do that. And of course, it depends on the nature of work and where folks are at. But I think that element of escape, of peer support, and of acknowledgement in the workplace would be some of the steps in the right direction to just begin the conversations of how do we support caregivers in the workplace.
Thank you. Yeah, those are great. Thank you.
Well, I guess I should have pointed out initially, but I'll do it now. You are our first millennial caregiver guest on our podcast. It's one of the reasons we were so excited to have you.
I'm so excited too. Yes.
Yes. And in your book, The Millennial Caregiver, you have a whole list of unique challenges that you experience, because you're a millennial caregiver. Can you talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, a few things come to mind about, the connection between being a millennial and caregiving. There's just to sort of set the stage. Millennial caregivers, if you're in the millennial generation and you're in a caregiving role for somebody who's ailing, you tend to be younger. Maybe and millennials tend to be starting their family, pursuing home ownership, establishing kind of career norms a little bit later than prior generations. In some ways, that's tied to kind of generational events that have happened for millennials. The financial crisis, the pandemic, where that have kind of pushed out traditional milestones. There's also kind of choices that are happening where people are having fewer kids and choosing to start families a little bit later if they're choosing to at all. So there's a general shift, I think, generationally for millennials compared to older or earlier generations. And millennials, I think, finally, just as a note, tend to be moving home or back to where they're from in a greater proportion than prior generations too. So you end up having these people who are kind of still establishing different traditional life markers, who are living with their parents or near their parents and still figuring stuff out, and then are kind of in for the shock of, well, they're not ready for their parents to age or ail because they're still looking for that kind of traditional support as they figure things out. So I think there is a real surprise and a real shift that's happening for this generation in comparison to prior generations, who are kind of hitting some of these life milestones a little bit later. That being said, millennials are the first generation to also kind of be used to having technology at our disposal, right? We've come of age with the iPhone and the internet and all of this wonderful stuff. And we also expect to have rapid answers at our fingertips. Now, the problem with caregiving is you can't find an answer to everything that's going on with somebody who's declining. And that sense of confusion and frustration cannot be solved by technology. Technology can be a resource. It can help us stay organized, but it's not going to solve the problem, which is somebody you care about is declining and you have to figure out what to do. And so I think there's this real sense of disruption in life stage. I think there's this real sense of confusion related to navigating the healthcare system, as we were talking about before, and looking to technology to try and address the problem and it not being able to in the way that we're used to. And that constellation of factors, while we're also trying to manage maybe kids, maybe career progression, is really challenging, I think, in a way that can be paralyzing if we don't kind of acknowledge it and try and think about ways to move forward.
So what are one or two key messages that you would like your readers to walk away with?
I think the first one has to do with expectation management. It plays out in a few different ways. One is that you will not be able to make a plan and follow that plan perfectly when you're dealing with caregiving. And so the key is to figure out kind of what are some pivotal milestones that are deal breakers for you. So if you're a caregiver and you know that it is absolutely not on your bingo card that you will leave the workforce, either because you need the money, which many of us do, or because you have career aspirations, or because you recognize that it's good for your mental health to work, whatever it is. But if you know that you don't want to leave the workforce, then that is something that, is really important to you and you're not going to sacrifice it. And you're going to figure out other caregiving supports so that is not something that you give up. Similarly, if you know, okay, I am just not prepared to care for my loved one if they are at home, if they are no longer able to use the bathroom, then that is a kind of moment in which you need to figure out, okay, I know I'm going to need to seek residential help for my loved one. So, figure out kind of what are those milestones that are critical for you and offer yourself some grace and flexibility as you kind of navigate the path as much as you can. So figure out, recognize that you're not going to be able to expect everything and figure out what is kind of the absolute for you and navigate within that. So I think the other thing that's critical is to start as early as possible. Caregiving often means having to have really hard conversations before you're ready or pursue things before you're ready. And what I mean is things like, does your loved one have a will? Do you know kind of what their financial state is and what they can be able to afford, what they may need? Do you have power of attorney and healthcare proxies? Because pretty rapidly, especially if somebody is in cognitive decline, meaning, dementia, Alzheimer's, whatever the disease is, they may no longer be able to make decisions for themselves. And so you have to have those hard conversations with them as much as you can while they're still with it. So start early, especially if you're part of a caregiving team, meaning like if there's many family members who are involved, because you may not all be on the same page. It's hard to come to caregiving and forget about all the interactions we've had with our family members beforehand, right?
Yes.
And so bringing the group together takes time, as does figuring out all this legal financial stuff. So start as early as possible, and give yourself, as I said, some space along the way.
That's great. I like that you mentioned having grace. We had a prior guest on our show who talked about changing the G word from guilt to grace.
Yeah, I love that.
So we love that as well. So I like that.
Space and grace. I love
Space and
it.
grace.
Absolutely
We're
love
rhyming.
it. Yeah,
Yes.
I think we're going to just finish up here. We like to ask our favorite question. Since you did stress start as early as possible, that's not easy if you don't have somebody telling you or helping you to do that. So here's your chance, Dr. Rachael, to tell yourself and our listeners, if you were to go back to as early as possible, what are, and you might have already covered it in your takeaways, but what is a very key piece of advice you would give to your younger self in starting the caregiver journey?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think that it has to do with starting some of these legal processes a little bit early, thinking about things like, as I was just mentioning, kind of power of attorney, determining a healthcare proxy, understanding kind of the financial implications of, what it would take to support my dad. These are things that are very hard. I think you're very reactive, I think, when you're in a caregiving role. The person has a need at a particular time and you want to do everything to support them at that moment. We found lots of support therapists, for example, for my dad. And then in a month or 2 months, you'd gone down this path, you'd spent this money, which, feels worth it at the time. And it did nothing because he was in the next stage of decline.
Yeah.
And we had just kind of really, honed in and were frustrated, because of the time and money and whatnot that it took on a particular resource that wasn't particularly useful. And again, this goes back to that expectation kind of component. But I think that, there's so much that you get hyper focused on when you're in the caregiving space, and it evolves really fast. So figuring out what are those like big pillars that are necessary. And I think that they are, being able to make decisions rapidly for a loved one has to do with having power of attorney and having a healthcare proxy. Figuring out what is the budget or the reality of your financial situation, what the person has to support themselves, what resources you all have to contribute is critical, because, people go into huge debt as caregivers.
Yeah.
And it's really important to recognize. So trying to get a handle on that as early as possible is really critical. So I think having those tough conversations, including, end of life wishes and whatnot, as early as possible is really worthwhile.
Excellent advice, but there is a caveat. Now, if it's in your book, just tell our listeners, go to the book and read it. But there is one little caveat to going as early as possible. That is that your parents are young, they're healthy, they're lucid, and they're going to look at you like, why are we having these conversations? Do you have any advice on how to have these tough conversations?
Yeah, it's interesting. And this comes from somebody else that I was recently listening to, who was a caregiver, and her advice was, talk about it in the abstract and then bring it to the person. So, I was talking to so-and-so and they were recently working on their will. What would your wishes be? What do you think? Do you think it's worth us writing that down? You never know what's going to happen, right? And so figuring out organic ways to try and bring it up can be really beneficial. One of the things I do talk about in my book has to do with communication strategies among the family and with the loved one who's having this experience. There's a whole chapter about communication, because shameless pitch, but I think communication is one of those things we often throw away, and there's a whole science and art behind it. It doesn't make up for having, tough topics, but it really can make a difference in how we perceive it. Like that classic, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. That was drilled into me as a kid. And I think that, when a diagnosis does happen, if somebody does have a diagnosis, space and time for processing, but there's also kind of this important checklist that starts to come up of like, you know, I want you to be a part of your decisions and your life as it unfolds. And the earlier we have this conversation, the more agency you have in being able to do that, meaning the loved one, right? Because for my dad, had we not talked to him about, you know, his end of life wishes, etc., he wouldn't have been a player in his own end of life care. And because we knew what he wanted, we were able to honor what he did want. And I think that is another way to approach it, which is to say, like, this gives you as much autonomy as you could possibly have, recognizing we don't know what this is going to look like in the future. So different strategies depends on the person and your relationship with them, but lots of food for thought.
That's great stuff. And I still want our listeners to read your book anyway, even though you probably gave away a lot of content there. That was great.
No, there's so much. There's so much more. There's so much more that people can benefit from. And I think that anybody that reads your book is going to walk away feeling so much more powerful and informed, because, as I said before, you not only make suggestions and solutions, but you go to the meat of it and walk them through how that looks and what they do each step of the way. And that's very powerful. But I just want to say that everyone that reads your book is going to benefit. And we totally appreciate you coming and joining us today to share your journey with us. And one last question, and that is, how can people connect with you? How can they find you? And how can they find that great book?
Definitely. Thank you. The book is available. It's on bookshop.org, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all of the major retailers. So very much. And I've heard from many folks that it's in their local bookstores, which is always super exciting to kind of see it in the flesh. Friends from Portland, remote parts of Canada, Texas, and Massachusetts. So maybe you'll find it in your local bookstore if you go to it as well. But definitely available online. I have a personal website, rpiltchloeb.com. On LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. Would love to connect with anybody about caregiving.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to catch new episodes of Working Caregivers, the Invisible Employees podcast, every other Tuesday. Please also visit our website, invisibleemployeeadvocates.com, to subscribe to our newsletter, purchase our book, and learn more about how we can help you strengthen your workplace to become more supportive of working caregivers.